In the early morning hours of March 27, 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in bed in rural Ohio when he suddenly heard his door open. Now, he assumed it was just his great-grandparents coming in to check on him, and so, he's a kid, he just pretended to be asleep. But he heard whoever this was make their way across the bedroom because he heard the floorboards creaking, and at some point they were standing right next to his bed. And so curious, the little boy opened his eyes. And what he saw standing next to his bed was not his great-grandparents. It was a huge green monster. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button goes on vacation, do them a favor and paint the entire exterior of their house a blinding neon yellow. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Wednesday, March 26, 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers drove down a secluded 2-lane road in Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was very rural. It was basically just very small towns and farmland. And so as Linda drove down the road, kind of in the middle of nowhere, she looked out her window and she saw the sun setting over a field. She was coming home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned in a town nearby. Linda eventually turned down a gravel road and onto the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and her husband lived. She parked outside their old farmhouse, and then she grabbed a deposit bag with money from the pizza shop out of the back seat, and then she got out of her car. Their farm was so isolated that she couldn't hear any cars on the road or anything from the neighbors' houses, so it was completely quiet except for the sheep that were bleating in the field and the occasional sound of power tools coming from the barn. She walked around to the back of the barn, and she found Jack hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car. The two of them had been married for about 7 years, and even though this was actually Linda's third marriage, she really felt like Jack was her soulmate. In addition to owning the shop with Linda, the pizza shop, Jack also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant, and he also had a side business restoring cars. And so Linda often found him out here behind the barn working on a car around the time the sun was going down. And sitting in the grass beside the car, playing with a wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. And the second Damien saw Linda, he smiled and he got up and he rushed over to her to give her a big hug. And Damien's smile made Linda feel sort of bittersweet. Damien was the son of Linda's granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant at just 14 years old, and so as a result had not been in any position to take care of a baby. So Linda and Jack had offered to take Damien in and raise him for a few years while Amber finished high school and got on her feet. However, this was definitely not a perfect arrangement for many reasons, but one of those reasons was because Damien's father was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement. Even now, 4 years after, Damien's situation had been decided, the father still argued with Linda about how she wouldn't let him see his son. But Linda felt like as much as he was saying he wanted to be in Damien's life, she felt like at some point he was going to abandon this child, and so she really didn't want him to be around Damien at all. She didn't want her great-grandson to be abandoned like that. And besides, Damien would have another father figure in his life soon enough, because in the past few years, Amber had finished school, she had met a new man, and gotten married. And as soon as Damien finished up this year of preschool in a couple of months, Amber and her new husband were planning to take him in and raise him on their own. Linda was proud of Amber, how she had turned her life around. But she also felt a little sad, bittersweet, because she and Jack were going to miss having Damien around. They loved him. He was basically their son. Linda knew that Jack clearly was busy with this car and kind of didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello and then scooped Damien up and carried him over to the farmhouse. She opened up the door and she set him down and told him to go wash up before dinner. Then she went into the kitchen and she dropped the deposit bag from the pizza shop into a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to drop it off at the bank in the morning. Linda got out a pan and began cooking dinner, and pretty soon her husband Jack came inside, covered in car grease. While Jack washed his hands at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him about his day. And Jack kind of grumbled about this customer that he had sold a car to on a payment plan the previous year, who had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out there to the person's house tomorrow and repossess the car. Linda could see, Jack is obviously pretty tense here, but Linda knew it wasn't really that missed car payment that was bothering him. The truth was, Jack had been sort of tense really for the past week, ever since he had had this big argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been very shy and mild-mannered and really close with his dad. In fact, he was the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life had been falling off the rails. He was in the middle of a divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he'd been missing shifts at work. And so earlier that month, he had come by to ask Jack for money because his house was about to be foreclosed on. And Jack had drawn a line and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he'd have to clean up his act and get back to work. And so that had led to a very big fight. And so now Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried that he'd done real damage to his relationship with Greg, perhaps irreparably, because something pretty similar had also happened with Jack's other son, Travis. About 7 years earlier, when Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into this big argument that was so bad, Travis moved out, and then the two of them had not spoken since for 7 years. So Linda thought Jack must be worried that that would be the same thing that would happen with him and Greg. So while Jack washed his hands, Linda rubbed his shoulders and told him not to worry about Greg. He had a good head on his shoulders, and he just needed a little nudge to get back on track, and that's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right call and Greg would get through this rough patch sooner or later. Then Linda set the table and called the family to dinner. A little while later, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, Linda looked up at the clock and realized it was getting kind of late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and grumpy. So she scooped him up and took him to his room upstairs to get ready for bed. She helped him change into his PJs, she brushed his teeth, then tucked him in, gave him a kiss goodnight, and closed the door. Linda went back downstairs, and before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. Before long, Linda was in her bedroom, she had turned on a lamp, she had changed into her PJs and crawled under the covers. And then once Jack was settled in next to her, she turned off the light, and they fell asleep. But several hours later, Linda was suddenly woken up by this horribly loud noise, and she sat up and looked around, and when her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she gasped. The next morning, at a church a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting ready to start class, but she noticed there was an empty chair in her classroom. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. She knew Damien's great-grandparents led busy lives and had several different jobs and businesses, so she figured they must just be running late. So she began class and hoped they would just drop Damien off before he missed too much. And about an hour later, at 9:30 a.m., she was leading the class in morning sing-alongs when Damien suddenly came sprinting into the classroom. Now, at first, the teacher was relieved that Damien had shown up, but then she realized Damien looked frazzled and out of breath, and he didn't have his backpack, and he was wearing PJs, and there was the smear of something brown on his shirt. She ran over to him and knelt down next to him and realized the brown spot was dried blood. The teacher asked Damien what was going on, and he looked at her with this scared, confused expression, and he told her his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes later, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker, along with his partner, drove down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective for the Darke County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was in charge of the investigative unit. So when the department had gotten a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was sent out to investigate. According to the preschool teacher, a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had come into school covered in blood, out of breath, saying something about his great-grandparents' faces being, melting. The teacher identified the great-grandparents as Linda and Jack Myers. Now, Whitaker had no idea what Damien meant when he had said that their faces were melting, or what kind of situation, Whitaker and his partner would be walking into when they got to the farm. But he had a feeling it would not be good. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel road. And when Whitaker got out of his car, he immediately noticed how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by empty fields in every direction. Whitaker began walking towards the front door when he saw the front door was already wide open, but there was no clear sign of forced entry. But nonetheless, Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons and they stepped inside the house. Whitaker began calling out to see if anybody was home, but there was no response. From where he was standing, he saw there was another open door in the house that led to a set of stairs that went down presumably to the basement. Whitaker ignored the basement for now and instead continued clearing the first floor. So he went into the kitchen, and once he was sure it was clear, he continued down the hallway until he found a doorway that led into a bedroom. And when he went inside that bedroom, he found Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, and they were lying in their bed, side by side, and he could tell immediately they were both dead. Now, Jack was actually lying on his stomach, and he could tell right away there was a big bullet wound on the back of Jack's neck. As for Linda, she was on her back, and she had gunshot wounds to her face and her hand, as if she had raised her hand to defend herself before she was shot. And so at this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full search of the house just to make sure nobody else was there, and it was empty, and so the two went back to the bedroom to begin investigating the bodies. Whitaker put on a pair of latex gloves and touched the wound on Linda's face, and the blood was still warm and wet, so he figured likely they'd only been dead for maybe a few hours at most. He looked around the floor, and he didn't see any bullet casings, which meant the killer had gone through the trouble of picking them up afterwards to cover their tracks. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to this weird plasticky bundle that was lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker picked it up, and he saw it was a piece of quilting fabric that was balled up and covered in masking tape. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer likely taped it to the end of their gun to muffle the sound of the blast, and it must have, blown off at some point when they actually began shooting. Immediately, Whitaker wondered if this was a silencer, why the killer would need one so far out in the middle of nowhere. But when Whitaker left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs to the room right above where the murders had taken place, he found another bedroom that was full of stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And it was at this point that Whitaker realized, very likely the killer must have known there was going to be a toddler sleeping right upstairs when they did this, and so they needed the silencer in order to not wake the child when they committed this murder. And so this meant that the killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office swarmed the property. Whitaker went outside to supervise them, and pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over to look at a set of footprints that they had found in the mud. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints around the side of the house to a basement window. The window pane had been pried off, leaving an open hole that was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and looked through the open space, and he could see inside there was a set of stairs leading up to the main part of the house. And so he realized this must have been how the killer got inside. And it was also why, when they had first gone inside, that they had seen the door to the basement standing wide open. And so this only made Whitaker more sure that this crime had to have been committed by somebody close to this couple, because the killer obviously knew the layout of Linda and Jack's house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a cast of the footprints so they could figure out what type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. And then as Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that were running along the side of the house had clearly been severed. The killer clearly had planned ahead and made sure that nobody in this house could call for help. Just then, a truck pulled up at the end of the road, and a woman got out and started walking toward the house. Whitaker quickly went over to stop her from getting too close to the crime scene, and he asked her what she needed. And she said she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said that she had seen the police cars coming down the road, and she didn't really know what was going on, but she felt like she had information that they might want. The neighbor said that around 4:30 that morning, she'd seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been so dark that she hadn't been able to see what color it was, but it had stuck out to her because as far as she knew, the Myers did not own a minivan. And so hearing this, Whitaker realized, this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. And if that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened before 4:30 in the morning. And so this was potentially quite useful. And so he thanked the neighbor, and after she left, he went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to piece together a motive. He felt strongly that whoever had done this knew Linda and Jack, but that doesn't mean that the motive is clear. There could be any number of reasons they would attack them. Maybe it was a robbery. Maybe they were just, getting revenge or something. He didn't know, but as he began walking around the house, he found a literal deposit bag full of cash in the living room, which certainly suggested that this was not a robbery, because that would certainly have been taken. And also there were some pretty expensive electronics in the living room that also had not been touched, so robbery seemed to be out the door. But when Whitaker went back upstairs to take a closer look at the toddler's bedroom, he noticed something odd. There was a little red stain on the bedding that looked like dried blood. While forensics teams were still combing over the farmhouse, another investigator assigned to the case, a guy named Detective Mike Burns, went to the local preschool to speak to 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate connection to this little boy, who at this point looked scared and very confused. Now, he knew it was going to be very difficult for Damien to rehash something that was so traumatic, but Damien was the only potential witness in the house when his great-grandparents were killed. So speaking to him was the police's best bet at figuring out what happened. And so Burns sat down on the floor with Damien inside of a private room, and he asked him to explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in a 4-year-old way, said he had woken up around 8:45 and the house had been very quiet, so he'd gotten out of bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. And then he said that both of them had been in bed, and he thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. And then he realized there was blood on their face, and he said he had tried to wipe the blood off with Kleenex wipes. But there was so much of it that he realized something was very wrong. He thought for a second that their faces were melting. And so, to save his great-grandparents, he had run the full mile down the road to his preschool to get help. Burns was surprised that this 4-year-old could remember and articulate so much about such an awful experience. But he was very grateful because the child's story explained why there was blood on Damien's shirt. However, it did not explain why they'd also found blood on Damien's bed. So he asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien said no. He'd gone straight out the front door and gone to his school. Burns thought there had to be more to the story, though, because otherwise he just couldn't explain how blood wound up in Damien's room. So he brought over a dollhouse, and he asked Damien to go ahead and act out everything that had happened the night before, using toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien put the toy that represented himself into bed in one room, and then he put Jack and Linda into the bed in the other room. And he said everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtimes. But later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open, and he said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. And Damien paused, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't really sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just imagining things or describing a nightmare or something. But then Damien set the toys down, and then to represent this green monster, he used his fingers to crawl across the floor of the dollhouse toward Damien's bed. Damien said he had heard the door open in his room and he had opened his eyes just a little bit, but he didn't want to give away that he was fully awake, so he's just squinting his eyes. And he said when he did that, he saw the green monster right next to his bed. And the green monster was pointing a gun at him. And Damien was so terrified, he said he shut his eyes and just pretended to be asleep. And then he said when he opened his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's recollection was almost certainly not a dream. More likely than not, Damien had come face to face with his grandparents' killer. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, 19-year-old Amber Holscher. And so the detective drove out to Amber's house, which was in a nearby town, and when he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. Now, at this point, nobody in the family had been notified yet about the murders, so Amber seemed to have no idea why a detective was now standing on her doorstep. Now, Burns knew this, and so he said to her, "Can I please come inside? We need to speak." And so, confused, Amber said okay, and she let him inside, and they sat down in the living room. And then Burns said to her, very gently, that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. But when Amber heard this, she just looked confused and asked what he meant, like, where are they? So Burns took a deep breath and he clarified that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked and immediately asked, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns said, no, he's alive, but he's going to be kept in protective custody for a while in case whoever killed Jack and Linda try to hurt him too. And until they narrowed down the suspects, Damien would not be allowed to see anybody in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just began to cry. Burns felt horrible for her, but really he was thinking about Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible because every day that he didn't would be another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based both on Amber's reaction to the news and the fact that Damien did not mention seeing his mother on the night of the murder, Burns thought it was highly unlikely that Amber was a suspect, but she could know something that might help the investigation. So, once she calmed down, Burns asked her if she knew anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. And right away, she nodded, and she mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because she wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, just recently, Andrew had come to Linda's pizza shop and started a fight with her about custody. And it had escalated to the point where Andrew had publicly threatened to kill her. This obviously caught Burns' attention because it made perfect sense as a motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, well, Andrew would have an easier time getting custody of Damien. And so he thanked Amber and promised he would be in touch soon, and then as soon as he was back in his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and he told him what he'd learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew quickly came to the door and he let them inside and they sat down, and Andrew looked at them like, "What's going on?" And they told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered. And they watched Andrew for his reaction. And he seemed very surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset. Andrew would then admit that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about that big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew did not deny that he had literally threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do it. He said it was just an empty threat he made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew looked very suspicious, so he asked him for an alibi. And Andrew said he'd stayed over at a girl's house on the night of the murder, and in the morning he'd stopped by his dad's house and then gone straight to work. And you could ask all those people, and that's where he was. Whitaker wrote all this down and then asked Andrew a few more questions and then thanked him for his time. And then as soon as the detectives left, they immediately went to go check on Andrew's alibi. They went to that girl's house, then they went to Andrew's dad's house, and then they also went to his place of work, and everybody at those 3 locations all confirmed Andrew's alibi. So unless someone was lying, it left no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours away to Ohio to murder Jack and Linda. Whitaker was disappointed that they'd basically wasted most of the day on this lead that now looked like it wouldn't go anywhere. Especially knowing that, again, every moment in this case that it went unsolved was another moment that Damien would have to spend away from his family all alone. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and also his mother Amber, sat inside of his office feeling very frustrated. He had one goal for the day. He wanted to interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was looking like that was going to be harder than he had anticipated. So the day before, a bunch of sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends, and family members in particular had mentioned that Travis and Jack had some bad blood. And when Burns had dug through the files on Travis, he found out that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a problem. It appeared that Travis hadn't even been in Ohio in 7 years. The last anybody in the family had heard, he'd moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually didn't know where Travis was at all. And there was no other address on record for Travis, so Burns basically had no idea where he was. And so he began to wonder, how was he going to track Travis down? And he decided he should start by visiting Travis's younger brother and Jack's other son, whose name was Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he really wasn't sure how close the brothers might be, it was the only lead he really had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and he knocked on the front door. And a moment later, a young man in a baseball cap answered, and he looked very much like he'd been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers, and the young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg did not seem remotely surprised by this visit. He said the police had already contacted him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murder, and since then, he said he'd just been waiting for somebody to come by and talk to him, because he'd seen enough TV to know that family members were always the first suspects. But when they got into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks because there was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was, and Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother, Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He'd come here hoping to figure out where Travis might be, but he never imagined he would just find Travis standing in Greg's house. And this was a big development because really until now, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg would actually tell him that Travis had been in Ohio for the past several weeks, staying in an apartment that he had rented right nearby. Burns did think the timing seemed very suspicious. It just seemed way too convenient that Travis had come back into town for the first time in almost a decade, right before Jack and Linda were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And also at this point, it just seemed really suspicious that these two brothers are just standing here waiting for police to come question them. Something felt off. So Burns, operating on a gut instinct, told them both that in order to question them, they actually had to come with him to the station and do it formally down there. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns opened the door of the Darke County Sheriff's Office and he showed Greg and Travis Myers inside. Now, neither of the brothers were under arrest yet, but Burns had a feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them could be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while Burns' partner took Travis into a room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down in front of the desk, Burns noticed that he wasn't making eye contact with him. He was sort of acting shifty. But pretty quickly, Greg said he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted if it could help solve his dad and stepmother's murders. And so Burns immediately began asking questions. He asked Greg what he was doing in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. And Greg told him that mostly he was just asleep. That is, until about 4:30 when he got up to go to his job at a factory that was a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the whole night and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan and he clocked in at 5:23 a.m. And he even had a signed time card back home that would prove it. And Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Because remember, that neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 on the morning of the murders, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi were shaky or didn't check out, the timing alone likely ruled him out. It basically was impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30 a.m. when he left, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive to the factory and be able to clock in at 5:23 a.m. when he had his time card stamped. That just wasn't enough time to do all that. And also, pretty much everybody in the family had told Burns that Greg was quite close with Jack and Linda. Now, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So even though Greg remained a suspect, Burns decided he would shift his focus to Travis. So Burns asked Greg how had Travis reacted when he heard about Jack and Linda's murders. And he said Travis had been upset, but he'd mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, because Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Travis was estranged. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken, and that those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that falling out between Jack and Travis, and Greg said it just came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money, and they had this big argument that got really ugly, so Travis had just quit the business and moved away. Burns thought about this, and he wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if so, that would definitely be a solid motive for murder. And so Burns made two mental notes. One was to look into Greg's alibi, and the other was to look into Jack's will to see how his assets were going to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. And he went right down the hall, and he waited outside the door while his partner finished questioning Travis. Burns' partner would say that Travis had seemed really nervous from the very moment he stepped inside the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing in Ohio, and Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently. And he'd realized that he'd never actually met his brother Greg's children, so he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then the detective asked him what he was doing when Jack and Linda were killed, and Travis stuttered out that he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked him if he had anybody who could confirm that, and Travis kind of hesitated and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car, and Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car, a white minivan. After getting debriefed by his partner about this interview with Travis, Burns went back into his office. By this point, Greg had been moved out and put in a different room, and Burns sat down at his desk and he began going over the evidence they'd collected so far. Now, the investigation to this point had been moving really quickly, and so there actually wasn't a whole lot of evidence yet. In fact, it had only been 24 hours since the forensics were sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on pretty much everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited for more evidence was go follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. After all, they are the victims' children, and he already thought that the killer had to be connected personally to the victims, and they both drove minivans. So really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns' phone rang. He picked it up, and it was a local man who said he had seen a news report about Jack and Linda's murders, and he had some information that just might help. The man said that a few days earlier, his friend had called him to see if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man who's talking to Burns, asked this friend why they needed the gun, the friend said it was because they, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man told Burns the name of his friend who said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who his murderer was. Based on this phone call, as well as forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of March 27, 2003. Early on the morning of the murders, the killer woke up and got out of bed and right away put on a green hunting jumpsuit, and they also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun that they had purchased from a classified ad 2 days earlier, and they carried all their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped in the driver's seat, turned on the car, and then drove a familiar route through the dark open fields. They were calm at first, until they turned onto the gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm. At that point, their heart began to race. Now, the killer felt like they had planned all of this out and prepared for anything that could go wrong. So now really all they had to do was just control themselves and just stick to the plan. And so the killer parked right outside the farmhouse, and then while staying in the car, they climbed into the back seat of the minivan and they grabbed their shotgun. Then they grabbed this thick quilting fabric and they wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and they used masking tape to secure it. That was their DIY silencer. But as they went through this plan, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous because as much as they had planned for this, it really was not something they actually wanted to do, but they felt like they had to. So after their gun had its silencer on it, they slung it over their shoulder, then they got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. And once they were there, they cut the phone lines so nobody inside would be able to call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt and they pried open the basement window and they climbed inside. Once inside, the killer walked to the stairs, they went up to the first floor, and they walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside, and there they were, sleeping in their beds, and the killer took a deep breath and then raised their shotgun, and they fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot had blasted off the homemade silencer, and so basically it wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud, and that homemade silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. And almost immediately, from the chaos, Linda sat up, and she looked straight at the killer, and she saw what was happening, and she just raised a hand to try to defend herself. And in a moment of panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her, and they fired twice. And one blast went through her hand, and the other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and waited. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the second two were so loud, they knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person who they knew was in this house, someone they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure they didn't have any loose ends, they left Linda and Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. And they went inside, and they carefully walked over right next to the boy's bed, and they raised their shotgun and aimed it at this child, waiting to see if they were awake. But the little boy appeared to be asleep, and so the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun, and they walked out of the room. Once they were out in the hallway, they shut Damien's door, and then hurried right out of the house. And from there, they got back in their minivan, and they sped off. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their clothes into a river, and then they changed into their work clothes, and they drove to the factory, where they would clock in at precisely 5:23 a.m. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having problems with money and drug abuse, and his father, Jack, had refused to help him, and they were fighting about it. But Greg knew he would inherit the farm if his father died, and he was so desperate, he decided murder was his best option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have actually had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. Greg was ultimately arrested about 48 hours after the crime, so quickly that police were actually still gathering evidence to use against him. They later found the gun, other supplies, and shoes that matched the prints found outside the house in a river right near the farm. And fingerprints and receipts tied all the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he would go to live with his mother Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now doing very well. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of December 10th, 1995, a seasoned homicide detective walked into a house on a quiet street in the suburbs of Tucson, Arizona. Another officer led him down the hallway to a bedroom, and when the detective looked inside, he froze. Now, he'd seen a lot of crime scenes before, but this one had to be one of the worst. I mean, there was blood everywhere. All over the walls, all over the floors, the mattress. I mean, it was just a complete nightmare. But as much as it appeared like clearly he's looking at the scene of a murder, there was a problem. There was no body. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please hide mousetraps in all of the follow button shoes. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of December 8th, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound. It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal. And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door, and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft, and she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues, largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. But Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. I mean, basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, she wasn't that surprised. She'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. She knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but she knew behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? She couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room. She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, he and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and then the house was quiet. And she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to an eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Faust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Faust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Faust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Faust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house. And right away, a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Faust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall, which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids, all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. Faust nodded, and then the photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately saw what he was talking about. There was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Faust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Faust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. It's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Faust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Faust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Faust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Faust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard, and when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Faust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Faust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Faust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Faust, very gently, asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before, when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Faust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, and then after the attack being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house, it suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Faust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Faust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing, and they were just looking for their mom, but he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand, and as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Faust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Faust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Faust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Faust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Faust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Faust looked at Bradley for his reaction, he saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything. And as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Faust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Faust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Faust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Faust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie. But just then, Faust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Faust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Faust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Faust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Faust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Faust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Faust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Faust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Faust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Faust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified, and he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Faust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Faust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car it was heartbreaking. And so Faust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Faust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Faust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Faust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag, and told Faust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab, and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they'd come back with a match that really surprised Detective Faust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Faust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So, Faust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Faust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked, and now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Faust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Faust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out, because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample, and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Faust answered his office phone, and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Faust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Faust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Faust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Faust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Faust was pulled onto other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Faust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Faust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives. Sitting inside the interrogation room, Lyle seemed obviously nervous and very jumpy, and when Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle made excuses for the killer, saying that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy. Maybe he was just, quote, on a bad trip. Now, Faust thought this was incredibly suspicious to be talking that way, so he asked Lyle for a DNA sample. And he got one, and he sent it off to the crime lab. And Faust had to wait several weeks for the results, and when they finally came in, Lyle Winstead was not a match. And at that point, Faust was feeling really frustrated. I mean, they'd already put in so much work with really nothing to show for it, and he didn't want the momentum on the case to die again. So before he put Bonnie's file back on the shelf, he decided to go back to square one and make sure there wasn't anything he just plain missed. The next month, between all the other cases he was working on, Faust found time to go literally door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview everybody his team had already spoken to almost a year ago. Faust knew how gossip spread in quiet communities like this one, and even though nobody had been able to offer any leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe anything unusual might have surfaced since then. So he knocked on one door after another, and eventually, at a house down the street, a woman told him that she didn't know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating around the neighborhood that he might want to look into. So Faust did. And after so many frustrating dead ends to this point, it was ultimately this rumor that did allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and also DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on December 9th, 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, Bonnie's killer watched her house from a hiding spot where nobody could see them. The killer knew the Sanborns had been trying to move to Maryland, but the killer felt like before they did go to Maryland, if they did that, there was something the killer had to do. Around 3 a.m., as the killer was watching the house, they saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. And then the killer saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that lamp went out, leaving the entire house completely dark. The killer had intentionally waited for this moment. They wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep by the time they went inside. And so now that the lights were off and that it seemed like the coast was clear, the killer grabbed their flex ties and also their chipping hammer and then began making their way towards the home. A chipping hammer is a very particular type of hammer that has a sort of typical one side that you would use to strike something, but the back of that hammer is sharp, almost like a pickaxe. And so with this barbaric tool they were about to use in hand, they slowly crept their way across Bonnie's backyard right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. And they found it was unlocked, just like they thought it would be. After all, they'd been to this house before, they sort of understood this one typically stayed unlocked, and they also knew what was on the other side of this door. It was Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding open the door, the killer stepped in, and they found Bonnie, asleep under the covers in her bed. And so thinking here was their chance, the killer began moving towards the bed. But as they stepped closer, a floorboard creaked, and Bonnie stirred awake. And she rolled over and looked in the direction of the creaking sound and made eye contact with the killer. And the killer knew they had to strike. So they grabbed a sock on the ground, jumped on top of Bonnie, and before she could scream, they jammed the sock into her mouth, they held her head, and then with that chipping hammer, they began striking her head over and over again, spraying blood all over the walls. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but before she stopped breathing, the killer used those flex ties to bind her hands behind her back. Then, as she was laying there, unable to defend herself, they searched around for her purse, and when they found it, they dumped it out on the bed, and after they had emptied it, they found her car keys. And so they grabbed the keys, and then the killer picked up Bonnie, still very much alive, and they carried her out that sliding door into the backyard, and then out into the garage. There, they used her car keys to unlock Bonnie's car, the blue Chrysler, and they put Bonnie in the back seat. Then they hopped in the driver's seat and they drove the car out into the desert where they parked on the side of the road. Then they climbed into the back seat where Bonnie was still very much alive, but mortally wounded and bound and couldn't go anywhere, and they sexually assaulted her literally as she died. When the killer was done with Bonnie, they simply got out of the car and left it where it was and walked back into town. And as the sun began to rise, the killer wandered right back down Bonnie Street in the direction of the Sanborn house. It would turn out Detective Faust had been so focused on finding the killer amongst Bonnie's immediate family and friends that he really hadn't even considered somebody else who was literally physically closest to the Sanborns, her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Now, Freddie was not actually, emotionally close with the Sanborns, but he and his dad had, in the past, gone out of their way to help Bonnie, by doing some repair work at her house. But what Faust had learned when he had gone back and re-interviewed all the people on the street to see if he had missed something, one of the other neighbors who was not remotely involved in what happened to Bonnie told Faust that there was actually a rumor that Freddie had found Bonnie attractive. And there was also another rumor floating around that Faust learned that previously a woman had been assaulted by a younger man in this neighborhood and that maybe it was Freddie. Now, it's unknown if Freddie actually was the subject of that second rumor, but it was enough for Faust and the police to go collect DNA samples from every young man on the block, and wouldn't you know it, Freddie's DNA came back as a match. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after Bonnie's murder. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Just after midnight on May 12, 2006, a man woke up inside of his quiet London suburb to the sound of pounding on his front door. He immediately got up and went and answered it, and he found one of his neighbors standing outside looking completely shocked. And the neighbor told the man that something horrible had happened to his sister. And so right away after hearing this, the man left his house and sprinted down the road towards his sister's house. And as he was running, he was terrified of what he was going to find because he was always warning his sister to be more careful, but she never listened. And then when he got to his sister's house, the first thing he saw was a trail of blood leading down her driveway. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is waiting for a very important piece of mail, make sure you sit outside near their mailbox, wait for it to arrive, and then immediately take it and put it in the shredder. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of May 11th, 2006, a 29-year-old hairdresser named Nisha Patel Nasri sat down for a rare break in between clients inside of her hair salon in the Wembley district of London. Nisha had opened up the salon when she was just 18 years old, and she'd been running it herself for the last 11 years. And in that time, she'd attracted around 2,000 regular customers, which was already very impressive, but it was particularly impressive because this was not like a big salon on a bustling city street. Instead, it was a tiny shop on a quiet residential road way out in the northwest suburbs of London. She actually ran the salon out of a single room in her brother's house, but through hard work and sheer talent, she had grown it into a thriving business. Now, generally speaking, Nisha was glad to be busy, because if she was busy, it meant she was making money. But sometimes, like right this second, stopping and kind of kicking back and relaxing for a second when she could felt very welcome. And so she plopped down into a salon chair, she grabbed the morning paper, and she started reading it. The front page story was about how the government had just released its report on the previous year's July 7th bombings, which were a series of terrorist attacks that had taken place on London's trains and buses during the morning rush hour. Now, it had been almost 10 months since these horrific attacks, but Londoners still did not feel safe. I mean, because of this attack, there was this growing fear of really all types of violent crime that could be visited upon them. It just felt like this shattered their worldview. And Nisha, more than most people, could really understand why people felt that way. In fact, she personally had experienced an attempted home invasion recently. Just 5 days ago, when Nisha had been at her house, located about a block away from the salon, she had been making dinner when she had begun to hear the front mail slot rattling. So on her front door, there was a slot that could open up from the outside where the mail person could slide mail into her house. Now, when Nisha heard this, she didn't immediately, panic. I mean, it's pretty normal for mail to be dropped off through her door. But, she was curious, so she walked to the front of the house and she looked out the window to see who it was. Was it the mail person? Was it a neighbor? Was it a friend? But when she looked out, it was none of those people. It were these three men wearing dark clothes, so she didn't know who they were, and they were clearly trying to break into her house. But these men had picked the wrong house to rob, because in addition to being a hairdresser, Nisha was also a special constable, which was basically a part-time volunteer police officer. So instead of her, hiding or calling for help, she'd just gone out to confront the men herself. And they'd been so caught off guard by how confidently she strode out there and called them off that they'd literally just turned and ran away. Now, even though Nisha had really handled this quite well and basically scared these guys away, it left her feeling really unsettled. And so that, combined with the lasting trauma that Londoners felt because of the bombings of the year before, Nisha these days was feeling very much on edge. However, every time Nisha found herself sort of defaulting to that victim mindset, being fearful that something else terrible is going to happen to her, she would remind herself that, she was a special constable, and whatever problems were thrown her way, she would handle them like she always did. But even though for Nisha that was sort of a confidence booster, for other people in Nisha's family, they weren't so thrilled she was a special constable. In particular, her older brother, Caton, the one who actually owned the house where Nisha ran her salon, he had pleaded with her not to join the special constable program because he felt like the work was way too dangerous. There were constantly stories in the papers about attacks on police. And unlike full-time officers, special constables were not authorized to use weapons to defend themselves. But for Nisha, that had never been an issue. She felt very proud of what she was doing, especially now that everybody was so on edge after the July 7th bombings. Now was the time for people to continue to step up and keep London safe, and so she felt like that's what she was doing. And so as Nisha finished reading the front page of the paper, she heard a bell jingle on the front door of the salon. So she tucked the newspaper away, hopped up, and went to go greet her next client. Later that night, around 10 p.m., Nisha closed up shop and swept the salon floor. And then a few minutes later, she heard the front door jingle again, and she looked up and saw her husband, whose name was Fadi Nasri, walking in with a paper bag of takeout food. Nisha instinctively shouted up the stairs for her brother, Caton, who had come home from work earlier that evening and had been hanging out in his part of the house since then. And a moment later, he came down the stairs to join the couple for some food. Fadi spread out the plastic containers of Indian food on the coffee table in the waiting area, and Caton began eating, while Fadi went ahead and sat down in Nisha's salon chair to get his haircut. And Nisha was even more careful than usual with his haircut, because she and her husband were going to their brother's wedding in a couple of days, and Nisha and Fadi knew they'd be in all the wedding pictures, and so they wanted to look their best. While she cut Fadi's hair, She helped her brother talk through preparations for the wedding. Their mother and father had both passed away years ago, so when it came to big family events like this, the two siblings were kind of on their own. Caton reminisced about how he'd given Nisha away at her own wedding, which was exactly 3 years ago yesterday, since their own father couldn't. Nisha smiled as she continued cutting Fadi's hair. Thinking about their wedding anniversary reminded her how grateful she was for her husband and the life they'd built together since. A few months after they had gotten married, Nisha had loaned Fadi some money to open up a limousine rental company, and his business had really taken off. And Nisha was proud to see her husband working these long hours and making great money. It felt like they really were a team, two ambitious, successful business owners working together to build a better future. Once Fadi's haircut was done, Nisha called Caton over and she gave him a pre-wedding trim as well. And as she finished up, Caton asked her if maybe she wanted to spend the night here at his house. He was still rattled by that attempted break-in at Nisha's house a couple of days earlier, and he really didn't feel like she was safe in her own home. But Nisha said no. We're fine. So around 11 p.m., Nisha and her husband Fadi walked back to their house, which was, again, right around the corner. Their house was a cream-colored, two-story home with red shingles on the roof. And along with Fadi's car in the driveway, there was a stretch limo and a Humvee parked on the curb that Fadi used for work, and which both very much stood out in their middle-class neighborhood. Nisha unlocked the door and then tossed her phone and keys on the sofa and then went upstairs to get ready for bed. But while she was in the bathroom washing her face, Fadi popped his head in and told her he was heading out to go meet with his friend to go play snooker, which is a way of saying pool, but in the UK. Now, Nisha was not offended that he wanted to go out and see his friend, like that was fine. But in reality, she and her husband had been talking about wanting to start a family. And for the most part, they both agreed that now was the time to, try to have kids. And so when she was thinking about tonight, she was thinking, maybe we could, try to have a baby tonight. But it just seemed like not only tonight, but just generally speaking, every time there was like a window to, try to have a kid, Fadi was either too tired or he was going out with friends, or it just seemed like he would say he was interested, but then when it was time to actually do the thing, he was nowhere to be found. And so it seemed like that was happening again tonight. But it was late and Nisha didn't feel like arguing with her husband. So she dried her face and just told Fadi to have fun with his friend. A few minutes later, as Nisha brushed her teeth, she heard the sound of her husband's car pulling out of the driveway. A little bit later, she went downstairs and turned off the lights and locked the doors, and then went back upstairs and crawled into bed alone. But then, about 30 minutes later, right as Nisha is about to fall asleep, she hears these footsteps in her house, and she didn't hear the sound of her husband return home. She just hears these footsteps downstairs. And so she sits up and she's hearing these sounds, and she thinks to herself, it could be my husband. Or, because just less than a week ago, somebody tried to break into her house, she's thinking, are they back? Has someone broken into my house? And so not sure who was down there, she got out of bed quietly, grabbed a flashlight, tiptoed out of her room, and then began heading downstairs to see who was in her house. A few minutes later, one of Nisha's neighbors was woken up by blood-curdling screams in the street outside his house. He jumped out of bed, went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and when he looked out, he saw Nisha limping down the street in her nightgown with a flashlight in her hand. And so the neighbor instinctively called for an ambulance and then rushed outside to help Nisha. And when he caught up with Nisha, she was hobbling back up her own driveway, and he asked her if she was okay, and she just choked out that she'd been stabbed. But before she could say who stabbed her, she collapsed onto the pavement, clutching this bloody spot on her thigh. At this exact moment, the neighbor looked up from Nisha, and he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away down the street. By this point also, more people were trickling out onto the road, and another woman ran over to Nisha and put a towel on her leg and began pressing on the wound. And then as soon as the first neighbor who had gone outside and seen Nisha, as soon as he heard the ambulance coming down the road, he stood up and he bolted down the road to go find Nisha's brother and tell him what had happened and what he had seen. Just moments later, a few minutes before midnight, Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola felt his pager buzz. He was an experienced detective working out of the Wembley station, and that night he was the senior investigator on call in case any major crimes happened. He'd been hoping he could get through the shift without any emergencies, but when he called the station to see what that pager buzz was about, He could tell, there was clearly an emergency because the dispatcher told him to go to 17 Sudbury Avenue as quickly as possible. And so Scola hopped in his car, and a few minutes later, he pulled up to a very chaotic scene on a residential street. In the driveway of a cream-colored house with red shingles, paramedics were loading this young woman into an ambulance, and police officers were already cordoning off the area with tape to keep a crowd of very rowdy and restless neighbors away. As Scola walked closer to this house, he saw there was a trail of blood on the driveway. He flashed his badge to the other officers standing guard around the house, and they all lifted the crime scene tape to let him come inside. One of the officers told Scola there had been a stabbing, and the victim, the young woman, was in critical condition. And while the officers were debriefing him on what they knew so far, Scola noticed a car pull up out on the street, and a man got out of the car and began running towards the house, and as he did, he was clearly crying and screaming and just basically hysterical. As he got close enough, Scola heard this man frantically tell the paramedics that he was the victim's husband. And so Scola saw this happening and just made a mental note to make sure he interviewed that guy as soon as he had any idea what he was dealing with. Scola looked around and he noticed right away that there was a stretch limousine and also a black Humvee parked in front of this house, which, obviously those are expensive. And so, maybe those attracted burglars to the house and, maybe she was there when burglars went inside. So wrong place, wrong time. But when Scola walked up the driveway past the forensics team, who was already taking photos and collecting evidence, he noticed that the front door and the windows near the front door had no signs of forced entry. There was no damage done. And then also when Scola went around to the back of the house, the back door, the other entrance into the house, also did not show any sign of forced entry. And then when Scola went into the house, he noticed that in the living room, there was nothing broken or anything out of place, and in fact, he even saw a wallet and a stack of cash sitting out in the open, totally untouched. And so even though his initial theory was robbery, it was starting to look less and less likely. Scola left the living room and went into the kitchen, and there he noticed there was a butcher block that was clearly missing one of its knives. And this butcher block was at the very back of the counter behind a bunch of other items, including a row of champagne glasses that did not look like they had been disturbed. So he figured that, this knife could not have been taken during a struggle, like somebody, fighting with the victim, they grab the knife and then they stab her. The knife had to have been taken when there was relative peace in the house. Otherwise, those champagne glasses and the other stuff near the butcher's block would have been toppled over, and they weren't. And so Scola began to kind of piece together a working theory of what could have happened here. And what he came up with was the victim, the young woman, must have heard a noise that spooked her. And so she wound up going into her kitchen and she carefully got her knife to protect herself and then maybe stepped outside to investigate this noise. And as soon as she got out there, her attacker or whoever was out there making the noises, maybe they were trying to break in or something, they must have seen her, they get into some sort of altercation, the knife gets pulled out of her hand, and then she is stabbed with her own knife. Now, of course, this was really specific, and Scola had no idea if this was true or not, but it would sort of explain away all the anomalies he was seeing so far. A few minutes later, Scola went outside to speak to some of the neighbors who had gathered in the street. And one neighbor told Scola that he had actually seen a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away from the scene. But this neighbor said he had not seen the man's face, so he didn't know who it was. And so at this point, Scola figured the next thing he would need to do is just speak to the victim once she was stable, because she would obviously be able to give a better description of what happened and who her attacker actually was. But unfortunately, less than an hour later, while Scola was still at the crime scene, just kind of taking it all in and asking basic questions and gathering some evidence, he got a call from the hospital. His stabbing victim, Nisha Patel Nasri, had actually bled to death on the way to the hospital, which meant this was officially a murder investigation. The next morning, after Detective Scola was finally done processing the scene, he walked into the Wembley police station, and it was unusually quiet. The other officers looked very somber. A little bit confused, Scola asked one of his colleagues what was going on here, and she would tell him that the victim, Nisha from last night's murder, was one of their own. She was a special constable, and plenty of officers in the Wembley station had worked with her. And so Scola now understood, what a gut punch this really was. But also, this information was pretty interesting to Scola, because at first, he thought Nisha was killed in like a random robbery gone wrong, but now Scola wondered if this murder was not random at all. Maybe Nisha was being targeted because she was a police officer. Maybe there was a criminal who she had put behind bars or prosecuted in some way that was out to get her. And when Scola began doing some digging on Nisha and some of her police work, he learned that Nisha had actually had somebody try to break into her house a few days earlier. There were these 3 men that she had basically scared off when they had tried to break into her house. And so now Scola's thinking that can't be a coincidence. And so right away, a team of officers got to work trying to figure out the identities of those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house the first time. And so while the officers did that, Scola headed back to the crime scene to go see if he could find that knife that was missing from the kitchen. He figured at this point that had to be the murder weapon. And if it was, the killer's fingerprints or DNA could be on the knife. When Scola pulled up on Sudbury Avenue a little bit later, he saw swarms of reporters and TV cameras crowding around the house, where the crime scene tape was still up, keeping them back. And as Scola approached the house, a reporter noticed him and ran towards him with a microphone and began asking him questions. Namely, did the police have any idea why a special constable had been murdered at her own home? But Scola brushed the reporter off. He was not about to talk about this case yet. He really did not have any information to give up anyways. And he ducked under the police tape. Once inside the cordoned off area, Scola saw there were dozens of officers already scouring the area looking for this missing knife, dumping out trash cans and digging through the bushes. Scola caught one of the investigators' eyes and she kind of shrugged, which Scola took to mean that they hadn't found it yet. Scola also watched as 2 other officers hauled this high-powered vacuum out of a truck and over to a storm drain on the curb. And then they turned on this vacuum and began sucking up everything out of the drain, presumably to look for this knife. Scola walked over to them right as they began sifting through what they had sucked up. The vacuum had pulled up a whole bunch of stuff between leaves and trash and food wrappers, but ultimately there was no knife. Scola figured the killer must have dumped this knife somewhere near the crime scene, because they couldn't have gotten far before they realized they needed to get rid of it. And so Scola felt confident that this knife was going to turn up eventually. They just had to keep on looking. In the meantime, Scola went back inside the house, where he found a pair of investigators sitting in the living room with Nisha's husband, Fadi. And Fadi had his phone out, and he was playing a recording of this woman shouting violent threats. One of the officers who saw Scola pulled him aside and caught him up to speed. They said that Fadi had a solid alibi for the time of Nisha's murder. He was with a friend playing snooker a few miles away, and that friend had already confirmed it. And the officer also told Scola that Fadi had come forward and said that he already had a pretty good idea of who might have killed his wife. And so Scola sat down on the couch next to Fadi, and Fadi at that point started his story from the beginning. He said that 2 months ago, he'd gotten into a feud with a rival limo business owner in Scotland. He said that he had sold a Humvee to this other company under the condition that after the sale, Fadi could borrow it back for one last job. But the other company's owner had gone back on the deal and refused to let him borrow the car after the transaction. So in a moment of what he was calling poor judgment, Fadi had traveled to Scotland, rented the Humvee under a fake name, and driven it all the way back to London. But then Fadi said, while he was driving back to London, clearly the other owner figured out what Fadi was up to, because they gave Fadi a call, and Fadi recorded the voicemail they left. And so Fadi played the recording of this other business owner for Scola. And Scola, he heard this woman screaming over and over again that she was going to kill Fadi and his wife if he didn't bring her Humvee back. And as Scola listened, he thought this woman did not sound like she was joking. This seemed like a real threat. Now, Fadi said he did return the Humvee. He gave it back to the business owner, and so she no longer had a reason to kill him and his wife. Still, though, Fadi felt strongly that, this woman really had it out for them, and so he wanted the police to look into her. And for Scola, they really didn't have that many leads to think of, and so he figured he would check it out first. So he took Fadi's phone to download that audio recording and also all the call logs, and then he promised he would send a team to Scotland to look into this right away. One afternoon, about a month later, Detective Scola sat in his office alone, going over the case files again and again. He was stressed because the media had been covering Nisha's murder since day one, and there was a lot of public pressure to solve this case. But the police had been investigating it really aggressively for a month, but realistically had almost nothing to show for it. Ever since Scola's last conversation with Fadi, the investigation had been moving very slowly. Some detectives had gone to Scotland to look into this rival business owner angle who had, supposedly threatened Fadi and his wife, but they hadn't found anything notable. So that lead was looking like a bust. Also, the homicide team had not been able to identify those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house 5 days before she was killed. Scola and his team had interviewed Nisha's family, her friends, her neighbors, but so far they had not been able to identify any likely suspects, again outside of that business owner in Scotland. It just didn't seem like there was anyone who would have wanted to hurt Nisha. She was liked and respected by basically everyone they spoke to. However, there had been one pretty significant development in the case over the past month, and it was that police had finally found a knife that looked similar to the one missing from Nisha's kitchen. It was found in a storm drain about a block away from her house. However, Scola was still waiting for the crime lab to actually determine whether it was the murder weapon or not. But just then, Scola got a phone call, and it was someone from the crime lab. And they told him that after analyzing this knife, they had found traces of Nisha's blood on the blade. So this definitely was the murder weapon. For the first time in weeks, Scola felt really optimistic. He finally had a real piece of hard evidence, a fresh clue here to really lead this investigation. And now he needed all hands on deck. So he hung up the phone and then gathered his team for a meeting. And then once they were all together, he told the other detectives that they had found the murder weapon. But they had to keep their discovery a secret. If the killer found out police had this knife, they might panic and flee. And so to avoid jeopardizing the investigation, Scola wanted to keep the discovery out of the press. After everybody was aligned on that, the next step in the investigation was that Scola was going to send officers out to collect video from all the security cameras near where the knife had been found. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the entire world, with hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras everywhere. So Scola figured one of those cameras must have captured the person who dropped that knife into the drain. The homicide squad would spend the rest of the week combing through countless hours of CCTV footage from the area, hoping to find the moment when the knife got dropped in the storm drain. But it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. However, after about a week of this, another detective eagerly called Scola over to his computer. He said he had finally found something that could be useful. And so Scola walked over, and the detective said that the footage he was looking at, which was paused at the moment, was of a CCTV camera taken from a shop that was on the same road as the storm drain. And so Scola bent down and stared at the screen as the detective hit play on the video. Now, the storm drain itself was just barely out of frame, but the camera clearly captured the glow of headlights as a car pulled up near the storm drain. The car stopped there for about 7 seconds. And even though you cannot see anybody getting out and disposing of a knife into the drain, the car was stopped long enough that somebody could have done that before the car took off again. But critically, when this car took off again, it passed through this camera's frame very clearly. And as the car drove past the storefront, the detective paused the camera. As soon as he did, Scola leaned in closer to get a better look at this car. Now, the video was dark and grainy, so right away it was impossible to read the license plate on the car. But despite the graininess, there definitely were a few identifying details Scola could make out. The car was clearly a gray Audi, and there was an antenna in the center of the roof, and also one of the lights above the license plate was not working. Now, Scola knew there were literally tens of thousands of Audis in London, and so they knew the only way they'd track this one down is by sending officers out into the street to literally look for it. But really what they're looking for is Audis that have that antenna on the roof and a light that doesn't work in front. Now, of course, this was going to be extremely time-consuming, but Scola felt like they didn't have a better lead here, and so they began this process. And for the next few weeks, that's all they were doing, just out on the streets canvassing for this Audi, and they didn't find it. And so as this investigation was feeling like it was about to hit another dead end, Scola felt like he just couldn't let that happen. There was too much pressure on him to get this done. But then suddenly, he thought about something that he'd totally put out of his mind. Fadi's phone. They'd actually taken the phone from Fadi 2 months ago to download that voicemail and also download the call log, but they actually hadn't given it back to Fadi yet. They were just holding the phone in evidence right now. Now, Scola felt like that audio message on the phone really had not amounted to anything and likely wouldn't. But Scola figured, why don't we look in that phone to see what else is on there? Maybe there were fresh clues about who might have wanted to hurt Nisha. So he assigned one of his forensic techs to download everything from Fadi's phone onto a drive. And then once they had done that, Scola took this drive and he plugged it into his computer and began sorting through all this data. He saw a photo that caught his eye. The photo was of a woman's thigh, and she was clearly lying in a bed in what looked like a hotel room. And even with the bright flash and poor camera quality, Scola could tell that the woman's skin was pale white, and so it was definitely not Nisha's leg. After finding this photo on Fadi's phone, Scola immediately drove to Nisha and Fadi's house. And when Fadi opened the door, Scola stepped inside and showed him the photo and asked him point blank if he was having an affair. Fadi right away said no, and he insisted he would never do that to Nisha, and the woman in the picture was literally just a friend. Now, Scola immediately felt like Fadi was lying. He did not believe him for a second. But there was no way to, force Fadi to tell the truth. And so ultimately, all Scola could do was just leave, get back in his car, go back to the station. And on the drive there, he wondered to himself if he had sort of just blown that opportunity. Should he have waited for more solid evidence before confronting Fadi? But he was also thinking that, there's so much pressure on him to solve this case, that he just had to make moves like this, take some chances. And so it is what it is. When Scola got to the precinct, he parked his car and he went in his office to think. And almost as soon as he sat down, there was a knock at the door. It was a man named Sid Shenoy, who was the family liaison officer who'd been working with Nisha's family. His job was to support the grieving family and communicate with them throughout the investigation. And so as a result of this role he was playing, Sid had created a level of trust with the family that really none of the other detectives had with the family. And Shenoy, when he walked in the room, told Scola that he'd just gotten a really interesting call from Fadi. He said Fadi had confessed to something that he'd basically been too afraid to tell Scola in person when he had just been visiting him, a couple minutes ago. And so Shenoy told Scola that you really ought to call Fadi and let him tell you what he just told me. And so right away, that's what Scola did. He called Fadi. And Fadi, when he picked up, he sounded very nervous and anxious and ashamed as he broke down and admitted that actually, yes, he was having an affair. He had lied. He said the leg in the photo belonged to a woman named Laura Mocking, and she was a Lithuanian sex worker who he'd been seeing for 3 months before his wife's death. Fadi said the reason he had lied to Scola is because he didn't want Nisha's family to find out he'd been cheating on her. But Scola knew there was also another obvious reason to lie here, because an affair would clearly give Fadi a motive to kill his wife. Fadi had been crossed off the suspect list at this point just based on his alibi. But this affair now made him look very suspicious. However, Scola just felt like it just didn't make sense that Fadi would be the killer. Number one, he did have a strong alibi. And also, two, apart from hiding this affair, which you could justify, you could say that obviously he didn't want ripple effect damage on the family or something. He'd been very cooperative with the investigation. I mean, he'd given them his phone, which had this damning photo on it. I mean, he'd sort of been very forthright. And so a new theory began to take hold in Scola's mind. If Fadi wasn't the killer, maybe it was possible that his mistress, Laura, was, or at least was directly involved in some way. I mean, she would have all the reason in the world to want to get rid of Nisha. So on September 1st, almost 4 months after Nisha was murdered, her husband's mistress, Laura Mocking, was brought into the station on suspicion of murder. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted her with all the evidence they had gathered that showed her relationship with Fadi was not just a casual affair. The two of them had met at a brothel where Laura was working as a sex worker, but eventually she stopped charging him to see her, which likely meant she must have developed real feelings for him. And so the detectives suggested that, if Nisha was gone for good, Laura would have Fadi all to herself. Laura insisted she did not know anything about the murder, and then she gave them a solid alibi. But that didn't mean much, because eyewitnesses thought they saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away after Nisha was stabbed. So the working theory was if Laura was involved in this murder, it was pretty likely that she had hired somebody else to do the dirty work. However, the detectives did not have real evidence. And so, despite their suspicions, they had to release her. And then once again, they were back at square one. However, not long after Laura was allowed to go home, Scola was walking through the precinct when the family liaison officer, Sid Shenoy, came running up behind him. Shenoy told him that he just had a very interesting conversation with Nisha's brother, Caton. Caton had told him that after finding out about Fadi's affair, he had been furious. The whole family was so upset about it. And Caton said that now that he really had this horrible opinion of Fadi, he felt comfortable sharing something about Fadi that he had been keeping to himself. Caton told Shenoy that he thought Fadi might not be the professional businessman he pretended to be. Instead, Caton said that Fadi might actually be involved with something criminal. According to Caton, Fadi had said there were a lot of sketchy people in his contacts, and he was worried about what the police might find on his phone. But Caton said that Fadi had not been specific about what he meant when he said sketchy people. He didn't know what he was saying or why he was involved with them. And so after hearing this, Scola told his team to go through Fadi's phone records and run the name of every person who appeared in his call log. And apart from all the calls back and forth to Laura, the mistress, there was one other name that jumped out, a convicted drug dealer named Roger Leslie. And when Scola saw this, he realized that he might have been approaching this investigation all wrong. He'd really struggled to find suspects because there was no one who would have wanted to hurt Nisha who didn't have an alibi. But now he realized that maybe that was the case because Nisha was not actually the killer's target. Maybe the target was Fadi. If Fadi was involved in the drug trade, then anyone could have come after him for any number of reasons. It could have been a drug deal gone wrong, or retribution for a debt he didn't pay, or even maybe a hit by a rival gang. He didn't know, but there was way more possibilities here. And the more Scola dug into Fadi, the more suspicious evidence he found. He learned that before Fadi and Nisha got married, Fadi had run an escort agency. He closed it down and started a more legitimate business 3 years ago, but Scola knew there could be any number of former employees or customers wives who might still have a problem with Fadi. And then there was that threatening voicemail from the rival limo company. That whole story made it seem entirely possible that Fadi could easily get wrapped up in very serious business disputes, which meant there could be more disgruntled rivals out there. Basically, it seemed entirely possible that there were loads of people out there who might have had it out for Fadi, not Nisha. And so that became the new direction of this investigation. And so the first person Scola looked into with this new direction was Roger Leslie, the drug dealer who had made a few calls to Fadi. However, there was one issue that kept Roger from becoming a primary suspect. He didn't own a gray Audi. So if he was involved in the murder, he probably didn't work alone. And so the police set up a trace on Roger Leslie's phone, hoping that his call logs would lead them to an associate who did own a gray Audi. And eventually, they sure did. And that person who owned the gray Audi was the missing piece that made the whole puzzle come together. Based on those call logs and all the other evidence found during this investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Nisha Patel Nasri on May 11th, 2006. Around 11:50 p.m., just as Nisha was falling asleep, the killer pulled up to her house in the passenger seat of a gray Audi. The driver waited in the car while the killer got out and crept around to the back of the house. And as he walked to the back of the house, he kept looking in the windows to confirm all the lights were out. And they were. And then when he got to the back door, he pulled out a key he'd managed to get his hands on to open it up. And then once the door was open, he stepped inside. The killer slowly moved through the kitchen and then stopped because he heard the floorboards upstairs creaking. And so he held his breath as he realized that somebody upstairs was making their way downstairs. They were caught. The killer didn't know what to do. They hadn't prepared for this at all. He thought everybody in the house would be asleep. So he panicked and he reached over and pulled a knife out of that butcher's block in the kitchen and then ducked behind a wall to hide. He heard the footsteps getting closer and closer, and he's trying his best to hide. And then he saw a beam of a flashlight make its way into the kitchen, and then it comes across and lands squarely right on them. And the person holding that flashlight was Fadi's wife, Nisha. When Nisha saw the killer, she screamed and ran for the front door. But the killer knew he could not let her get away because now she'd gotten a clear look at his face and he was caught. So he chased her outside, out into the driveway, clutching that kitchen knife in his hand, and about halfway down the driveway, he tackled her and then sunk the knife deep into her thigh. Nisha actually managed to fight him off despite this gaping wound in her leg, and she scrambled up and began running down the street screaming for help. And at this point, the killer saw lights coming on in the neighbors' houses, and his heart was pounding, and he knew that Nisha was no longer his biggest problem. He had to get out of here immediately before anybody on the block saw his face too. So he just sprinted back to the Audi, where the driver was still waiting for him, and he told the driver to go, just take off, drive out of here. And so the driver, they did just that, but they were panicked and confused, and as they're going around the corner, they're asking the killer, like, what just happened? I mean, as far as the driver knew, they were only here to pick up some ecstasy for a drug deal. They did not expect anybody to get stabbed. But the killer just snapped at the driver to stop talking about it because he hadn't expected the night to go this way either. It was a total mess. And so at this point, the killer looked down at the bloody knife that was still in his hand, and he realized he had to get rid of it. And so he told the driver to just pull over. And so the driver did. They pulled over to the curb on this commercial street just a block away from Nisha's house, and the killer quickly opened up the door and threw the knife into a nearby storm drain. Then he slammed the door shut again, and as the Audi careened down the road, the killer took the driver's cell phone out of the cup holder and called the man who'd hired him to tell him everything that had just gone horribly wrong. The person he called was the drug dealer, Roger Leslie. However, when Roger got off that phone call with the killer, Roger immediately called the person who'd hired him. Roger had actually been hired to pull off a hit, but he didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he'd outsource the job. But now, after having spoken to the killer about this botched hit where basically they stabbed her and they had no idea if she actually was going to die or not, in fact, the last thing they saw was her running down the road screaming for help, now Roger knew he would have to explain himself to the actual mastermind of the murder plot, the person who'd given him the key to get inside. And that person was indeed Fadi Nasri, Nisha's husband. It turned out that Fadi was involved with a bunch of criminals. But they weren't after him. They were his friends. Because even though Fadi pretended to be this successful, legitimate businessman, he really was not. He was deep in debt, and he'd paid Roger Leslie to kill Nisha for the life insurance money. That way he could pay his debts and then also run off with his new mistress, Laura. And so while Nisha had been wanting to start a family and was starting to sense that maybe Fadi was not fully committed to that idea, well, her instincts were good because it turned out Fadi did not want to start a family with her. He wanted to kill her and move on. According to prosecutors, that earlier break-in at Nisha and Fadi's house a few days before she was killed was very likely either a reconnaissance mission or a failed first attempt to kill Nisha. In the end, 4 people were arrested and charged with Nisha's murder. They were Fadi Nasri, Roger Leslie, the hitman who actually stabbed Nisha, his name was Jason Jones, and the driver of the car, a man named Tony Emanuel. Now, the driver was acquitted, but the other 3 men were all convicted and sentenced to life in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On May 22, 1993, a man named Kurt was carrying some boxes into his new home. He had just moved into this two-story house along with his fiancée, whose name was Kim. Kurt went into the house and he dropped the boxes in the foyer, and then he turned back to head back down to the car to get another load. And as he walked down the steps, he passed his fiancée, Kim, and they smiled at each other. She was making her way up, he was making his way down. But seconds after they passed each other, right as Kurt got back to the car, he felt this incredible pressure and blast wave hit him in the back that almost sent him flying. And then when Kurt turned around, he could not believe what he saw. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and replace their toothpaste with numbing cream. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Friday, May 21st, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kim Wenger clapped her hands together in front of her with happiness in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in rural Iowa. Her closest friends had gathered here to throw Kim and her fiancé, 32-year-old Kurt Simon, a combination wedding shower and goodbye party, and now they were presenting the couple with their gift. It was a money tree, planted in a little yellow coffee can with envelopes full of cash hanging off of it. Kim and Kurt both smiled and began making their way through the crowd to give everybody a big hug and to say thank you. Tonight was a big night for them. All their plans were finally falling into place. Tomorrow, they would pack all of Kurt's belongings into their car, and they would drive 230 miles south from the place where he had been living in Iowa to the city of Bloomington, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, where Kim already lived. And in Bloomington, they would begin their new life together as a soon-to-be married couple, raising Kim's 2 children from previous relationships. It had been a whirlwind 8 months since they had first met on actually a blind date. Kim had known almost immediately that Kurt really was something special, but it hadn't been easy for them to get to this point. They both had almost no money. Kurt was studying to be a Presbyterian minister and living in Iowa to finish seminary school. And Kim was a single mom living in Bloomington who had just recently quit her office job because her coworker was sexually harassing her. She'd taken on off-the-books work as a hairdresser and house cleaner, but she still had to rely on public assistance to make ends meet. The long-distance relationship itself was also just exhausting, with all the driving back and forth. And it didn't help that Kim had contentious relationships with the fathers of both of her kids. Her 1-year-old son's father, Dale Fosdick, was always late with his child support payments, and he still acted like he was entitled to walk right into Kim's house anytime he wanted. Kurt had actually recently confronted him about doing that and told him to stop, which Dale did not seem to appreciate. Her 7-year-old daughter's father, Todd Wenger, really wasn't much better. Todd fought with Kim all the time over their custody arrangement, and he and her other ex, Dale, were actually friends, which really annoyed Kim. But now, as somebody handed Kim a piece of cake in the church basement, all those problems seemed like they were about to get a whole lot smaller. Kurt was moving in, and Kim was about to get her whole life organized. Waiting for her at home in Bloomington, she had a whole collection of modern bride magazines so she could plan their wedding, and she and Kurt were actually talking about Kurt maybe adopting her son. And she knew Kurt could very quickly get a job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor, and they could maybe save some money by only having to pay for one residence now. And this money tree they were getting was a sweet start. I mean, Kim knew that the members of the congregation were not wealthy people by any stretch. But, she found it very touching that they'd pooled their limited resources to give her and Kurt such a wonderful send-off. The only thing that could make this moment any better would be if Kim's mother, Cricket, was there. But unfortunately, Kim and Cricket were estranged. Kim wished she could be closer to her mother, but Cricket had a mean streak, and for some reason, she really hated Kurt. Kim finished her cake and then checked the time, and she realized, it was time to go, so she tapped Kurt on the shoulder as he was speaking to some friends. They had a lot left to pack tomorrow morning, and they had a long drive ahead of them. So Kim and Kurt made their goodbyes and then headed out of the church holding hands. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd, and Kim and Kurt spent the first part of the day packing and then the second part driving. And then finally, at 10:30 p.m. that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's two-story house in Bloomington, the home they would now share together. Kem just sat for a second in the passenger seat while Kurt got out of the car and opened up the trunk. They had a lot of stuff to carry in, but Kem was just exhausted and frankly didn't feel like doing it quite yet. So she watched as Kurt went ahead and walked up the front stairs carrying a box and the money tree. He unlocked the door, he stepped inside, and then a minute later, he came back out empty-handed. And at that point, Kem sighed and decided she better get out and help too. Kurt was halfway back down the stairs as Kem grabbed her own box out of the trunk and walked her way into the house, into the foyer of her home. She put her box down and was about to go back outside and do another trip with Kurt when she paused. There was something she didn't recognize on the floor of the foyer that had not been there when she had left for Iowa. Kurt was outside, facing away from the house, when an intense wave of pressure hit him from behind. And nearly at the exact same time, this booming sound like some kind of explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward almost uncontrollably and then whipped around and called out for Kem. But his ears were ringing now and he couldn't really tell if she had answered. There was smoke pouring out from the front door of their house, and instinctively he just ran into the house, into the foyer to go find Kem. When he got in there, there's all this smoke and chaos, there's shards of broken glass everywhere, and also he noticed all these little pieces of what looked like metal kind of all over the foyer. Kurt screamed Kem's name over and over, and he looked frantically all around through all the rubble, but it was impossible to see. It was like everything was destroyed in here. And so now, beginning to gasp from all the smoke, he started walking around the foyer, kind of ducking below the smoke as best as he could, and that's when he saw legs on the floor. Minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled up outside the two-story house in his cruiser, with his partner beside him and another squad car behind them. Shepard did not usually respond to 911 calls because he was a homicide detective, but he had happened to be in the area when dispatch requested officers go check out a report of potentially a shotgun blast on a residential street. However, the second he stepped out of his car and looked at this two-story house, Shepard knew this could not have been a shotgun blast. There was all this black smoke billowing out the front door of the house, and although Shepard couldn't see any fire, he could hear the fire alarm going off inside. And outside, the street was chaos. There were all these people who Shepard guessed must be neighbors shouting and running around, and there was debris everywhere. Broken glass and splintered pieces of wood and chunks of metal that had basically been blown out of the house out onto the street. In the driveway of this home, Shepard could see there was a man who had his hands on his head and he looked frantic, and he was yelling the name Kem over and over again as he looked towards the destroyed house. And it was at that point Shepard realized there must be someone or multiple people inside of the house, and he really couldn't wait for backup to go find them. So he and his partner shouted for everyone to stay back, and then they raced up the stairs into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the front foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just lots of smoke kind of hanging in the air, and he looked around and he saw there was a 6-inch hole on the wall right near the front door, and there was another hole right in the floor of the foyer. But even though he saw those things pretty quickly, his attention quickly snapped to the body of a woman who was on the ground, and it was immediately clear that there was nothing they could do for her. Literally half of her head was just missing. In his entire career, Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But standing in this blackened, destroyed foyer over the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt sure that that is exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this point, the officers from the other squad car had now come up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard told them to get back, go back outside, because the scene was not safe to process yet. They needed the fire department here, and they needed the bomb squad, because there could be more explosives. Not long afterwards, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad combed through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a bit more about what had happened. The dead woman was Kem Wenger, and the man he had seen screaming in the driveway was Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors said the pair had arrived around 10:30 p.m., and a couple of the neighbors had actually noticed them before the blast went off when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said that they saw Kurt be the first one to go inside the house, and when he did, he went in carrying a box that he had pulled from the back of the car. And then these neighbors said they saw Kurt come out again empty-handed, but he went down to the back of the car again and he appeared to put something in the trunk. And at the same time, Kem had grabbed a box from the car and she went into the house by herself, and that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. He thought it was suspicious that Kurt had been able to walk into the house without getting hurt, and then just seconds later, Kem goes in and her arrival seems to have triggered the explosion. And so naturally, he wondered if maybe that box Kurt was carrying that he went inside with, maybe that was the bomb, and he planted it. And then when he left, she goes in and it obviously goes off. And then also he wondered, what had Kurt put back into his car after he came out again? What did he put into the trunk? But even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. And that was wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard did not need to be a bomb expert to know that these could be components of a bomb, and that whoever killed Kem must have built the bomb right there in her basement, which naturally made Kurt Simon the #1 suspect. So Shepard told a crime scene tech to process Kurt's vehicle and pay extra attention to the trunk. Then the detective walked over to Kurt himself. And Kurt was rocking back and forth, and he was crying, and he was still just saying Kem over and over and over again. Shepard asked Kurt if he could tell him, what had happened here. And Kurt looked at him with this vacant and shocked expression, and he told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He'd gone inside with a box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast behind him. And at this, Shepard's eyes narrowed, because according to the neighbor's account, they said Kurt was actually at his trunk, putting something back into the car at the time of the explosion. But Kurt was now claiming that he had actually only just exited the house, basically was on the stairs as the blast happened. Now, this discrepancy could just be a result of confusion, or Kurt could be lying to cover up whatever he may or may not have done. But independent of whatever this was, Shepard just told Kurt that right now he was going down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, a little before dawn on Sunday, May 23, 1993, Detective Shepard walked out of the interrogation room in the Bloomington, Illinois police station, where he'd just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a pretty difficult interview. He had plenty of ideas about other people who might have killed Kem. He told Shepard that both the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, fought with her all the time. And he said that Kem's estranged mom, Wilma Lewis, who everybody called Cricket, was, quote, every kind of evil. But Kurt had seemed to have no information to offer about what he had actually witnessed before the explosion. He had stuck to a story that he had not seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard found hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb exploded on Kem and not on him, and he also denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also said he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why the neighbors said he had. Shepard ultimately thought Kurt was either the most unobservant person alive, or he was lying. And on top of all that, Kurt had refused to take a lie detector test. However, Shepard still had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have anywhere near enough evidence to arrest Kurt, at least not yet. At this point, the bomb squad was actually still searching the house for any additional bombs, so the crime scene techs had not gotten in yet to begin to start looking for forensic evidence. They actually hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body yet. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be very busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying and questioning Kem's family members. And now Shepard was sure there was going to be quite a few interrogations for him to conduct. He'd already been awake for 24 hours by this point, but he knew there was not going to be any sleep soon. So he walked to the office coffee pot and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it and thinking about how he was going to nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the bombing itself was making huge news all across Illinois. By about 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, so less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were all these reporters milling around the front entrance of the police station, and some were even going in and out of the lobby, trying to talk to people and get any information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger. because the Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, to help them process the scene. And all that meant there was going to be an enormous amount of pressure on Shepard, who was leading the investigation. And this pressure was especially stressful this morning because the case he'd thought he'd had against Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon, was starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, everyone had said Kem and Kurt had a good relationship and were excited to start their life together. The crime scene unit had searched Kurt's car, where neighbors claimed they had seen him place something in the trunk right after the explosion or manipulate something back there, maybe a detonator. But the crime scene techs had found nothing suspicious at all back there. Shepard's partner had checked out Kurt's story that he had spent the entire week previous to the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and he was moving here to Bloomington to live with Kem. And they had found out that that story was true. He really had been in Iowa. And so this made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem was home all week and Kurt wasn't there. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given police 2 additional pieces of information that really widened the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had recently gone missing. And the second thing was, because the spare key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out at some point and had to cut a hole in the screen in the back door to get inside. And so this meant that basically anybody could have gotten inside of Kem's house to build the bomb if they just went in through the back door. Or if they, had the key, if they stole the key. So Shepard's suspect list effectively had gone from Kurt to all of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Wenger, was sitting waiting for him. With Kem's fiancé, Kurt, looking less and less likely as a suspect, the detectives had set their sight on Kem's exes. Both Todd, who was the father of Kem's daughter, and Dale Fosdick, who was the father of Kem's son, not only had obvious motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule, because each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend before she was killed. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale. Basically a couple of hours after the explosion, he had spoken to him, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. And during that exchange, Dale had seemed shocked by Kem's death, and he'd made what seemed like a good faith effort to answer the detective's questions, although his son kept crying and interrupting them. Dale did admit to having some tension with Kem, but he also had an alibi. He'd been with family in the morning and doing yard work in full view of his neighbors in the afternoon and the evening. He'd given Shepard's partner names and phone numbers of potential witnesses that could have witnessed this, and a preliminary round of calls to those witnesses had suggested that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all their interviews with very little information about the crime itself, because they didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be, right nearby to detonate it, or if maybe it had been remote operated so the killer could be farther away, or maybe the bomb was just set to some kind of timer. Scientists at the ATF were trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the shrapnel, but until they did that, Shepard and his partner would not know exactly when the killer would have been at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that would help them narrow it down. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband Todd Wenger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. And Todd seemed a little nervous because he kept wringing his hands while he spoke. He said that he and Kem did fight about child support costs, and he said he had been very frustrated with her because he didn't feel like she was always fair during their divorce. But he insisted that that did not mean he wanted to hurt her. He said their problems were common for most divorced couples. Shepard did not put much stock in that assertion because in his experience, divorce or breakup plus money was a very good motive to hurt somebody. So he asked Todd where he'd been all day on the night of the blast. And at this question, Todd definitely appeared to relax, and he launched into a very detailed explanation of all his movements. He said he'd been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and both of them would definitely vouch for him, along with several people who had seen them during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure which of the exes, Todd or Dale, he thought was a better candidate for his killer. Both had clearly been fighting with Kem or had real tension with Kem, but both had alibi witnesses. So, Kem's fiancé, Kurt, might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was set shortly before the explosion, but he had no clear motive. As for Todd and Dale, they seemed to have plenty of motive, but no real opportunity. And so Shepard decided his next move should be to talk again to Kem's family. Maybe they would be able to help him sort out his flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, so almost 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kem's sister, Joni, lived. Now, by this point, another officer had already been there to tell her and their mother, Cricket, about Kem's death, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. Now, Shepard had been told that Kem and her mother were estranged, but even though he went in with some idea that this interaction could be odd, Shepard was still really caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was like way over the top. As Joni welcomed Shepard inside and offered him a seat on the couch, she was crying. Her reaction to the death of her sister seemed very genuine. But Cricket was not crying or showing any signs of being sad. Instead, she was just furious, and not about the murder, or about losing her child, or about the fact that police had not made an arrest yet. She was furious about her child's life insurance policy, which apparently Kem had not added her to as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to be paid any money despite her child being killed. As Shepard seeing this, he thought about how Kurt had insisted in his interrogation that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. Now, at the time, Shepard had not really taken that seriously because he figured Kurt was trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and lots of people don't like their mother-in-laws. But now he was reconsidering. He felt like he was witnessing someone who could be just as bad as they were described to be. And then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her now deceased daughter, Cricket went off, but not about her relationship really with Kem, but more about Kurt and how Kurt had ruined Kem's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kem and that he had destroyed the best relationship she ever had, which Cricket said was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kem's son. She also said that Kurt had destroyed her, Cricket's relationship with Kem too. She said that she and her daughter used to talk every day, but once Kurt was in the picture, she had been forbidden to call the house at all. Now, to Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered, bouncing from one subject to another and just mad about everything. But he started to wonder if what he was witnessing here was not just pure selfishness and being a terrible person, but instead could be some kind of very complicated grief or maybe even guilt, or grief and guilt combined. But one thing was definitely true, which was Cricket really seemed to hate Kurt as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard just wasn't sure which one of them was in the right. But it was around this point in the conversation that Kem's sister, Joni, cut in, and she offered up a potential suspect idea of her own. She said that Kem had recently left a job where a colleague, a man named Phil Hartman, had sexually harassed her. Following this, Kem had actually gotten a settlement out of it, and apparently Phil had made threats afterwards, including a promise to get her for this. And so Joni said it was Phil who the police really should be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left the house, his head was spinning. He'd gone to Cricket and Joni, hoping for clarity, sorting out his 3 suspects. But he'd come away with less clarity, and now 5 suspects. Kem's fiancé Kurt, her exes Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, her co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. At this point, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning, and so he decided the best thing he could do now was just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe make sense of it then. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, so almost 2 days after the bombing that killed Kem Wenger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kem's house, feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate so the State Bomb Squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and actually look around for himself. Inside the house, he could see that the foyer was still in complete disarray, although Kem's body by this point had been removed and autopsied. There were also now all these little flags and markers all over the place, pointing out how she'd been positioned on the floor and where various bomb fragments and other evidence had been collected. And also now, because the feds had completed a preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually imagine how the bombing went down. There was a 6-inch hole in the foyer floor, and Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed, right there on the ground, probably concealed in some kind of a small box or package. From the autopsy, which had shown distinct damage to Kem's right hand, Shepard knew that what likely happened was that she had spotted the package and picked it up with her right hand, which then triggered the explosion. And this was actually the single most important thing the feds had been able to determine, that the bomb was motion activated. This was huge, because it meant the bomber did not have to be at or even near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually, which meant they could have left this thing there any time during the weekend. This also explained why there were a bunch of wires and bomb-making materials found in the basement, because if the bomb had been built somewhere else and transported to Kem's house in, say, a car, the bomb could have exploded along the way. So what likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to Kem's house that would not detonate as they carried it, and then they put the final touches on it right on site, once it was actually in position in the foyer. This also meant the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated, because building a bomb like this took technical skill, it took some intelligence and real attention to detail, because if you don't have those things, you can set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the table. She just did not strike him as organized enough or really coherent enough to build this type of bomb. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, both worked with machines for a living, so they were definitely still in. And her fiancé, Kurt, was highly educated, so he was still in. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the co-worker who Kem had accused of sexually harassing her. He had reached Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew just being physically far away from the bomb when it went off was not a perfect alibi, because it was motion activated. You could place it and then travel and be far away. But at the same time, Louisiana was really far away, and Phil really didn't seem to have any technical background that Shepard had found, so Phil was still in, but less so. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then clearly spent time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came up and they're in the foyer setting the bomb up. I mean, that's someone who's pretty confident they're not going to get caught doing all this inside the house. That's serious boldness. And so Shepard was starting to feel pretty confident that whoever had done this was either family to Kem or as close to her as family. Shepard left Kem's house thinking about how he might search both Dale and Todd's places of work to see if any of the machinery they used shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final step onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out behind him, and he turned to see a Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created real panic, not just in Bloomington, but across Illinois. People were now terrified that there was going to be a bomb that would show up on their front porch. They would see a package they didn't recognize, and they would call the police with fears that that could be an explosive. I mean, it was like this paranoia had swept the state. And so in response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked officers to recanvass Kem's neighborhood to question the neighbors again, now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, that the bomb was motion activated, which meant the bomber did not need to be there basically right before it went off. They were in the house. They were building the bomb days before. They planted the bomb in advance of the bombing. So there was a bigger window of time that they were wondering who was at Kem's house, who was acting suspicious near Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing. Those were the questions they had for the neighbors. And so this officer that was running over to Shepard, that's what they had been doing, recanvassing the neighborhood. And when he reached Shepard, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses, and there he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Wenger on May 22, 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car outside of Kem's house. They picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat, which contained a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With this in hand, they got out of the car and they walked up to the front door and they pulled a key from their pocket. This was the same key they had stolen from under the doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and they let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement, where they took all the various items from the bag and placed them on the counter, and they got to work. The killer was not worried about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well, and everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and they would not find it suspicious at all to see them there. Plus, they knew they would have an alibi for the time period when the bomb actually would go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but figured it didn't really matter since the explosion would take care of everything. Feeling very confident in their workmanship so far, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final steps, they could feel sweat beating on their forehead, because if they did anything wrong, the bomb would go off. But the killer got it all done, and they stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. And the girl looked at them and waved and said hello. And the killer, who felt like they belonged there and no one will remember me, they waved back. Well, the little girl remembered that interaction, and she would tell Detective Shepard who she saw leaving Kem's house. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now seeing Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had talked about adopting his own son, and this enraged him. He couldn't stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he'd acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to build a pipe bomb. And so ultimately, Dale was caught because of his entitlement to feel like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted. Because he did that all the time, despite her saying not to, he became a familiar face in the neighborhood. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the bomb, he was finally arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today we have two stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get the follow button some brand new tires for their car. But don't tell them you're going to install monster truck tires. Okay, let's get into our first story called Stirring the Pot. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. He really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. That really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column, but he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top, the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one, and Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch, and before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang, and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Our second and final story today is called The Resort. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he'd heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So, suddenly with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time. So this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And, as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear, and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt, and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other. And Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend, because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.